and natural habitats.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm sorry I'm not John. If you came to see John talk, don't worry. He's going to talk in 20 minutes.
Yes, I should have mentioned John's up next.
Yes. She loaded it up. I got it on.
No?
Do you want me to?
John? Did you load it on that computer but not this one?
Yeah.
Okay,
I don't
that's
know.
the problem.
Oh, sorry.
I don't know how to do this. Is John's on here too?
Might have to take out this guy.
Darn it.
AFS, and John Walter. Is it John No, just the John Walter. Just the John Walter.
While they're loading the talk, I know a lot of people
this is
have
a
joined
separate
us
talk and
since
a separate
the
session.
break.
Just open that
This group tonight will have a social, the Marine Artificial Reef Social.
Talk in another
It'll be in the
session
Marriott
later.
from 6 to 8 p.m.
John's
You're more than
comments.
welcome to attend that. It's sponsored by Little Mo Atlantis Reef Ball Foundation,
you
the
go.
Water Gremlin, and the Line Fish Control Team. So.
Perfect. All right, thanks. Sorry
All right.
about that.
Get your clicker back connected.
All right.
Hang on.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, so, John will talk next. I'm going to take his place for this one. And just in case I'm a little bit more boring than John and you fall asleep, most of this presentation is part of a paper that we published. It's Karnauskas et al. 2017 in MCF. So I'll jump right in. All right, so the motivation for this study was basically where are red snapper. We need a spatial map of red snapper, and you could imagine a lot of uses for such a map. Spatial planning, survey design as a basis for other studies. Here, for example, is a Atlantis ecosystem model. So lots of things use inputs on where red snapper are in space. And this is a map from Galloway et al. 2009. This was kind of the state of knowledge in terms of where red snapper were distributed. So we had some information on basically where the different age classes are found, but we lacked a finer scale map of distributions in space. So we're trying to improve on existing knowledge in this study. Okay, I guess this statement is probably fairly obvious to this crowd. There's a lot of artificial structures in the Gulf of Mexico. And in the study domain, the numbers you're seeing here are the numbers that were in our study domain, which was the depth limits for red snapper in the surveys that we used. So that was 7 to 140 meters. So we had 2,408 oil rigs and 8,245 artificial reefs. And then, of course, these are full of snapper. Again, I suspect I don't need to state that to this crowd. And so how do we create a comprehensive map with all of these artificial structures, because clearly they're important to red snapper. Okay, so this is our basic study schematic. Again, the sampling domain and the study domain was the northern Gulf of Mexico, depths from 7 to 140 meters. And the data that we used was an intensive Longline and handline sampling from 2011. This was the Congressional supplementary sampling program. That was a huge effort that was done in 2011, and they targeted sampling of platforms and reefs in other surveys that we combined with the CSSP. And then for the habitat data underlying the model, we used the U.S. seabed database. This is a figure of that database here. Basically, the type of substrate, it's a database on the type of substrate that exists at points all throughout the northern Gulf of Mexico. So we put together a statistical model, and the purpose of the modeling was really to merge the different data sources and account for survey artifacts. So obviously we can't survey the entire Gulf of Mexico all at the same time. So you have areas that are sampled at different times of day, slightly different months. And so when we're combining the data and looking at red snapper abundance across space, we want to account for these survey artifacts. And then with the model outputs, we did a predictive map. We predicted the distribution of red snapper by age, area, depth, and habitat type on a 10-kilometer square grid cell. Okay, I'll go into a little bit more detail on the sampling programs. Again, this is the 2011 Congressional supplemental sampling that we used. And these are the actual locations of the samples. As you can see, they're quite numerous, in the thousands, and they cover the entire northern Gulf of Mexico. This is the Longline sampling. The color map here is the total number per station. This is just the raw data plotted in space. There was paired vertical line sampling, so there was vertical line paired with the long line sampling, and then there was independent vertical line sampling. And the long line was stratified random, the hand line was stratified random, the paired bit, and then there was the vertical line on targeted natural reefs. And the key point here is that we could use this, because this vertical line was implemented in conjunction with the long line and independently, we could use this as a bridge across the habitat types to compare the catch rates. For the handline on platforms, we used a separate CMAP survey that was done. This was only done in this area here off the coast of Alabama, Louisiana, so obviously not across the entire region, which is one limitation. And then for the artificial reefs, we used a similar survey that was done by Powers and Dryman in the AARZ, the Alabama Artificial Reef Zone. Again, this obviously there's artificial reefs extending elsewhere, so the fact that the sampling was carried out over this limited areas is one limitation of this study. Okay, so the domains of inference. So again, we use the vertical line as a bridge between habitats because the vertical line was implemented, used to sample the different habitats. So the long line and the randomized habitats, the long line and randomized hand line were assumed to have inference everywhere but natural reefs and platforms and known artificial structures. Whereas the targeted hand line was assumed to have statistical inference over the natural reefs or the platforms or the artificial reefs, depending on the particular habitat that they were targeting. So this is a figure of the percent rock and gravel habitat. This is our assumption of the distribution of the natural reefs. And then this map is showing the percent artificial structure influence. This comes from a database that Mark Mueller put together in 2012. Now, because there's a lot of reefs that have been put out that are not necessarily permitted or not known, we did an interpolation. We took some information from one of Sean Powers' surveys. They had side scan sonar survey of the actual number of artificial reefs in the Alabama artificial reef zone. And so we interpolated the numbers from that survey onto this area to get a more realistic representation of the artificial reefs, including those that weren't necessarily permitted or kept track of by the state programs. And then for each of these artificial structures, we assumed that the area of influence was 100-meter radius from the center point. So in other words, for the purposes of this study, we assumed that the densities occurring on the artificial reefs or oil platforms extended out 100 meters in each direction. And this assumption was based on a thesis by Reynolds, 2007. And you can see this is this was based on acoustics, I believe. And she had a couple different plots, but this is just one example. So this is distance and the density of fish. And you can see it extends out approximately 100 meters before it really starts to drop off. So that was the assumption we used. Okay, now here we have in this slide a little bit of audience participation. I don't know if everyone remembers the Choose Your Own Adventure books that we all read in grade school, or at least I read in grade school. So we can go the quick and dirty. We can skip to a couple slides, or we can go through this statistical labyrinth of the methods that we used. So I know it's after lunch. Like a show of hands, who wants the quick and dirty? Okay, any votes for the statistical labyrinth? Okay. I'm going to refer the statistical labyrinth votes to the paper, and it's after lunch, and I haven't had my second coffee of the day, so I'm not feeling real good about explaining this, so we're going to skip ahead. Well, basically, No, never mind. I'm not going to go through that. All right, so here's the simplified methods. Essentially, again, the methodology is just a generalized linear method that was used to account for the artifacts of the surveys, like the surveying different parts of the Gulf at different times of day. And so all we wanted to do was correct for those relative catch rates that we got on the vertical line that was on the artificial reefs versus the natural reefs versus the platform. So the statistical mess goes in here, and we magically calculate a catch rate on different habitats. And this is a relative catch rate, it's a CPUE. So to get our map here, all we do is we take the area of the habitat, and then the catch rate on the habitat from that mess, and then that equals the relative abundance on the habitat. And so it's just a weighted average, very simple. And then we sum across all the habitats and then plot it for each grid cell. So this is the map of relative abundance of red snapper across the northern Gulf of Mexico that we get from that method. Okay, and I want to show, just so you think I'm not crazy or that I didn't get lost in that statistical mess, I'll show you the methods replicated with raw data. Again, the concept behind this is very simple. It's just a weighted average, and you can do it with just the raw data. So in this table, I'm showing the habitat type. This is the percent area of the Gulf of Mexico that's covered by each of these habitat types. Again, that's based on the U.S. seabed database, and then the areas of the platforms and artificial reefs is based on that 100-meter radius assumption. And then these are the raw data catch rates that just come out of the raw data from those surveys, and then you just multiply them together. Percent area times the catch rate gives you an index of relative abundance on each of those 4 habitat types, and that is then you just sum them up and then take the percentages. So this is the raw data percentage of total. Okay, so this is the number of red snapper on each of these habitat types is calculated by the raw data, and then these are the results of our statistical model, and just so you can compare those, I'll plot them for you. So the blue is the results from the raw calculation, and then the yellow is the results from the full statistical process. So you can see it's just doing a slight adjustment to account for those survey artifacts. So the back of the envelope calculation gives you the same answer, essentially. Okay, and then, so you might be asking, well, why did you do all that work, Mandy and John and others, if you're just going to get the same answer? Well, the nice part about the statistical model is that it predicts by age class. We had age, year, interaction effects, so we can predict, we get a whole lot more information out of that statistical model. So here we're showing you the difference in, so this is the ratio of catch rates between platforms and natural habitats and artificial reefs and natural habitats. So the difference is in the CPUE, and this is by age. So what we're saying here is that on oil platforms, you catch 22.4 times as many fish as you would catch on natural habitats. That's the ratio of the CPUEs. And we have that plotted out here. In blue is the platform difference between the natural reefs, and then in yellow is the artificial reef difference. So what you see here is that according to our surveys, the platforms, as others have noted in earlier presentations, the natural reefs tend to harbor much larger or older individuals, and you see the ratio drop off very rapidly on the platforms. The artificial reefs, not so much. They tend to maintain larger, older fish. So there's some differences between the platforms and artificial reefs there. And then again, these are the predictions across the Gulf of Mexico by age. So this is ages 1 and 2, age 5, age 7, and you can see the abundance sort of moving offshore. So it pretty much agrees with some of the general knowledge about red snapper biology. Okay, and then I'll go into the summary results and the interesting stuff. What is the contribution of artificial structures? So this is what came out of our model output. The number of red snapper that live on natural habitats, approximately 87%. All artificial structures, the contribution is about 13%, and of this, 2.3 is platforms, and 11% is on artificial reefs. And this is the index of abundance without artificial structures, and I'll flip back and forth. I think I have a little animation here. So you can kind of see I'm flipping back and forth between just what's on the natural reefs and what's on the artificial structures to kind of draw your eye as to where the artificial structures are really contributing numbers. And so you can see definitely in the Alabama artificial reef zone, over here in Texas, particularly closer to shore. So that's in terms of number. Again, because this was an age-structured model, we can calculate the biomass using conversions from age to weight. And because, again, a lot of the oil rigs in particular harbor younger fish in general, the contribution in terms of biomass is a bit lower according to our model. So we get about 8% on artificial structures, 0.5% on platforms, and 7.4 on artificial reefs. And there's our index of biomass with the artificial structures. And then finally, we calculate this in terms of fecundity or spawning potential, or number of eggs that would be spawned from these locations. And once again, you see that fecundity is slightly lower in terms of the contribution of artificial structures. Very little on platforms and about 6% on artificial reefs, according to our numbers. Okay, so locally, artificial structures are extremely important. So when you look at this map, your eye is kind of drawn to these purple, pink areas where it seems like there's a lot of fish on artificial structures. So what I'm showing here is the proportion of abundance on artificial structures, proportion of biomass, and proportion of fecundity on artificial structures. And again, it looks like a lot, but when you plot, right now I'm going to plot all of these grid cell values out on a histogram. It actually isn't so much. The mean proportion of abundance across the entire Gulf of Mexico is only about 8.3%. So yes, they're very important in certain areas, but when you average across the entire Gulf, there's not that many areas where the proportions are extremely high. Okay, so what are the caveats or assumptions that we have to be aware of in this study? So the handline gear was assumed to have the same catchability among habitats, and as others have pointed out, that can be a problem. You can have different catchability on different habitats. This also relies on databases of known artificial reefs and platforms. So obviously there's a lot of artificial reef structure out there that was put out there and we don't know about it, or as others have said, hurricanes come, take the stuff away. So just to give you an idea, though, if we, for example, underestimated the number of artificial structures by half, basically the numbers that I showed you earlier would be doubled, so it would be a twofold contribution. Also, the area of influence was assumed to be constant across surrounding area and the same for all artificial structures. So obviously, if we had better data on how those densities are maintained as you go out from artificial structures or different types of oil rigs, we could incorporate that. So some of the things we saw today could actually be incorporated into this method. This is also a snapshot of the 2011 distributions. And the platform survey was actually done in a different year. It was done in 2007, so we had to use some information from the stock assessment to bridge between those years. The artificial reef sampling, as I mentioned earlier, was limited to a relatively small area, so we don't know that those CPUE differences are the same across the entire Gulf of Mexico. And this is only a relative abundance map, so it doesn't tell us what the total number of red snapper is in the Gulf of Mexico. This is all in relative terms because we're looking at relative CPUEs. And also the statistical model doesn't capture the small scale variability. So in any given grid cell, depending if you're on a artificial reef or if you're on a bit of structure or just sand, you'd get really different catch rates, obviously. So this map doesn't work for identifying fishing locations. It just gives you the broad scale of distributions in red snapper. So in conclusion, am I doing okay on time? Okay. So in conclusion, the artificial structures can harbor the majority of red snapper present in certain hot spots that are locally important for fishing opportunities, as we all know. But when you calculate across the entire Gulf, the artificial structures comprise a small fraction of the total seafloor. It works out to be 0.15% if you use that 100-meter radius assumption. And so therefore, they harbor a relatively small fraction of the population, about 13% according to our estimate. And because artificial structures harbor a smaller, younger red snapper than those that are found on natural reefs, their contribution to the overall stock is lower in terms of biomass and spawning potential. Again, our numbers were about 8% and 6% of the total, respectively. And implications of the study for management. So obviously, the artificial structures have important local fishery impacts that should be considered when we're interpreting fishery-independent data. The detailed spatial map could be used to inform spatial management and survey design. And then I get a lot of questions on what does this mean for the stock assessment. So this information has little bearing on the stock assessment and stock status and catch advice coming out of the stock assessment. Both natural and artificial reefs and data from those reefs are included in the assessment. The assessment essentially averages those. And then the proportion of red snapper that occupies structures is relatively small to the total population. So if you had really big differences in growth rates or other dynamics on the natural versus artificial reefs, you could incorporate that into the assessment, but essentially it's just averaged right now. And for further implications, wait 2 minutes for John's talk.
During those 2 minutes while we switch out, there's time for a quick question.
Mandy, and maybe I'm skipping ahead to John's talk, but does the finding that the biomass of red snapper on artificial habitat is relatively small have implications in terms to the issue of our artificial habitats changing stock productivity of red snapper?
I think John is going to talk about it for the next 20 minutes.
I was trying to set him up, I guess.
Yeah, that's a very good setup.
All right, laying the groundwork there. Our last talk before the break. Here's John Walters.